Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 47, Fire and Ice. To say that Yang could barely remember the last time she had seen both her girlfriends at the same time would have been a little bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly felt that way to her. For nearly 2 months, both Coco and Velvet had been laden with coursework and assignments, so Yang had been having to make do with only seeing one at a time. And while she loved both of them individually, those moments certainly did not compare to having both of the girls around. Thankfully, though, she had been able to sneak into their room occasionally to join them in bed, but that had been the extent of their combined interaction for nearly 2 months. However, both of the girls had finally finished all of their work, so were free for an afternoon. So nestled up against a tree with both women at her side, Yang finally felt more complete than she had in a while. Sure, Velvet was still focused on her camera, but Yang was more than happy to gently run a finger along the girl's ears while Coco sat beside her, as they watched Weiss tutoring Flint across the field. MMM. Velvet hummed happily as Yang scratched the very tip of the long rabbit ear. Remember these two? Looking at Anisadora as Velvet held it up to show a picture of 2 girls, one with maroon hair and the other with purple. Octavia and Nebula, right? Nebula. Coco corrected her. Right. She hummed. Not really. Remember they didn't like FNKI or CPPR too much. Vacuo versus Atlas. Sounds about right. Velvet hummed, a sentiment that was quickly agreed on by Blake, who was sitting nearby. The girl had been very quiet as of late, and getting quieter with every passing day. Yang knew why, of course, and she had tried to talk to her, but the rapidly approaching visit from her dad seemed to have put the girl in a bitter mood. Of course, Yang knew it was just nerves, but she was deciding to let the girl calm down a little before trying to talk to her again. What about these? Velvet held up the camera again, showing a green-haired girl and a gray-haired boy. Yang recognized them instantly. Aren't they the ones who tried to crash the tournament? Before Arslan and Scarlet told Ojban they weren't Haven students. MHM. Coco hummed. Shame, they just disappeared before it started. I never got to ask where she got that amazing outfit from. I wish I saw their weapons at least. Velvet commented sullenly. Could have been something fun to use. Oh well. Give Rubes a week in the workshop and she'll make you 100 weird weapons to have fun with. I genuinely believe she would. Coco chuckled. Where is she anyway? Blake? Eating. Training wore her out. She did push herself pretty hard this time. Yang hummed. Good for her. Coco replied appreciatively, lowering her glasses at Weiss and Flint as a flower bush was torn from its place with a loud rumble and flew towards the studying pair. Not bothering to hold her laughter in as she watched her friend duck beneath it only to be showered with dirt. Almost immediately, the girl stood to her feet and began to shout at the Atlesian boy. Only able to catch a few words, she turned to Velvet and raised an eyebrow. She's talking in Atlesian. Velvet shrugged. Probably calling him an idiot, Blake grumbled. Not exactly wrong. People go to extreme lengths to woo people. Yang grinned, unable to deny that it was stupid to fool around with gravity dust. You keep saying that and Weiss W. Huh. Yang cut off her friend as Flint pulled a hand from behind his back to reveal a pure white flower that had likely been pulled from the flying bush. Holding out to Weiss, the girl seemed to freeze. Her shouting stopped and her body seized up as her head looked down at the plant. For almost a second, Yang was hoping the girl would take it, but just as she suspected, Weiss quickly slapped the flower aside and picked up her book before storming off. It only took Flint a few seconds to follow her. Well, Coco grinned and shook her head. At least you were right about Flint's feelings? Nah, Yang countered. You see how she froze up? She normally just says no straight away. I don't know, Yang. Velvet smiled up at her. You're usually rather spot on, but Weiss really doesn't seem that interested. Please, Yang replied and poked the bunny girl on the nose, causing it to wiggle adorably. If those two aren't together in a couple of weeks, then I'll... You'll what? Coco interrupted eagerly. I'm ready to take this bet. All right then. Yang smirked and looked over at her girlfriend. If I'm wrong, you get my Rexars. Oh. Yang knew Coco had always loved those aviators, but Yang had been lucky enough to snatch up the last pair before the store ran out. I will absolutely. Wait. What if Yang is right? Uh. Oh, I know. Velvet sat up with a mischievous grin. How about, if Yang is right, she gets your Collins? What? The older girl said, aghast at the idea of giving up her favorite pair of sunglasses. That's hardly a fair trade. Hey! My limited edition, extremely rare aviators are definitely a fair trade for your 200 lean glasses. Please, I could get them from a reseller. But then, they would not have belonged to your loving girlfriend. You raise a good point. Coco hummed thoughtfully. How about, in addition to that? The girl cut herself off, giving Velvet a quick look. After a second, she pulled out her scroll and passed it over so that the other girl couldn't see. Curious as to what the extra reward could be, Yang quickly took it, and was unsurprised to see the words "loser pays" for Velvet to do whatever she wants for a day written on the screen. Yang could definitely relate to Coco's desire for that. While they both loved the little rabbit faunus, it was undeniable that the girl's interest was definitely very different to theirs. While Coco loved her fashion, something Yang was also fond of, and Yang herself loved fighting and kicking back with a drink, Velvet was much more academic. Technology, computers, and studying were all things that Velvet held an interest in, yet, as much as they tried, neither of them had been able to really get into them. They always tried to make sure they did something Velvet enjoyed, but they both knew the girl would love to be doing things such as visiting the CCT Tower and the numerous expos that were held in town. Unfortunately, due to her more reserved nature, and there being two of them, and one of her, she rarely ever told them when those were being held since she didn't want them to have to attend something they found boring. So, even though she really didn't need an excuse to want to treat Velvet, it was a few lean that she would be more than happy to lose. Deal? Yang grinned at her girlfriend as she passed the scroll back. Wait. What was it? None of your business. Coco grinned across at the girl. As if to cement the fact that she would be giving no information, the brunette slipped her sunglasses back into place and leaned back against the tree. As a result, Velvet turned to Yang with dangerous eyes. Dangerous because of just how cute they were. Big, brown, and adorable, they were usually enough to get Yang to do whatever the girl wanted, but not this time. Since Coco had written it down, Yang knew she definitely had something in mind already, so didn't want to ruin the surprise. Sorry, babe, she said with a small shrug, earning a pout in return. Determined to break it, she leaned in and pressed her lips against the faunus. It didn't take long for the pout to disappear and be replaced with a smile. Seeing that little sign of happiness had always made Yang feel better, so pulling back she let Velvet's head fall back onto her lap. However, watching as the girl's attention returned to her camera, Yang let her smile fade a little. Those moments, Coco at her side and Velvet on one of their laps, had become some of her favorite very quickly. The start of their relationship had been weird, with so much awkwardness of how things would work, especially since it was the first time Yang had been in a relationship, let alone been in one that had more than two people. However, much to her surprise, it had been rather easy. The awkwardness had not lasted very long, and they all quickly fell into a rhythm that worked for them. That, more than anything else, felt like proof to Yang that they were destined to be together. Unfortunately, even that couldn't stop the worry from occasionally creeping in. Despite all the happy moments, despite how easy the relationship was, the fact that the girls would eventually be leaving her alone in Vale for a year was still in the back of her mind. Though she knew there was a possibility they wouldn't even still be together by then, she liked to think they definitely would be. As far as she knew, Velvet and Coco really did love her, and she loved them both enough that she could easily say that wouldn't change anytime soon. However, most of their relationship had been spent with them all together, which they wouldn't be once they moved. Left alone, Coco and Velvet might realize they liked being alone together more than they liked being with her. Or they could stop loving her altogether. As much as she knew it was unlikely, it was still something that had worried her. The idea that she could simply be forgotten, left behind and alone, was something that had bothered her since she was a child. And as much as she wished those feelings would go away, they never did. Not completely, at least. Hey, Velvet said quietly, reaching up to run a finger through a strand of blonde hair. What are you thinking about? Looking down into the soft brown eyes, Yang contemplated lying for a second, but quickly decided against it. In all their conversations, every time this had sat down to talk about it, the one thing Coco and Velvet had asked was that she talk to them when she was feeling worried about something. And she'd promised she would. So, not wanting to break that promise, she let out a low breath and gave a small shrug. "You too," she said with a side glance at Coco, who she knew was paying attention. I miss being with you both over these 2 months, and I missed you when you went on that mission before break." I let out a small sigh. "I really don't know how I'm gonna do a year without you." "A year?" Coco asked with a raised eyebrow as her hand closed around Yang's. "It'll be a few months at a time, since you'll be coming to see us during your breaks." "I suppose," Yang grumbled. "Still a long time." "I know," Velvet said with a reassuring smile on her face. "But we are still going to be in contact all the time." "Exactly," Coco grinned. "We'll call you in the mornings, at nights, in the shower." She leaned in close. "While we're in bed. Not a single bit of fun will be missed." Despite her own thoughts, she felt a smile pull at her lips. Just as usual, Coco knew just how to tease a smile from her. As the smile pulled at her lips, Blake let out a frustrated breath and walked away, likely to join Ruby in getting some food. Chuckling a little and hoping her sister could help cheer her partner up a little, Yang leaned back into the tree and pulled Coco's hand up to kiss it. "Thanks," she said in a quiet voice. "I'm just worried, you know." "We know," Velvet said softly, reaching up to graze a finger along her chin. "But we are definitely not leaving you behind. These weeks have been hard for us too." "Warmer weather has been making up for the colder bed though," Coco quipped, only to be tapped by one of Velvet's ears. "What?" "She knows I'm joking. She also knows that we both love her, and that we will spend every day until we leave convincing her of that if we have to. Right, Yang?" "I do." She smiled and wrapped an arm around the older woman. "Sucks that you're probably going to have to do that anyway." "Not as much as you might think." Velvet smiled, letting her hand fall back to the camera. Holding it out, she snapped a picture of the three of them. "Just more opportunities for pictures." The little fauness quickly printed it off and gave it a shake before handing it to Yang. More than happy to accept it, she smiled down at how happy and relaxed the three of them looked. Pocketing it immediately, she leaned down and pressed a quick kiss against the girl's lips. Feeling at least a little better after her small down moment, she also gave the fauness a quick peck on the nose before sitting back and cuddling into Coco, determined to try and enjoy the last of their rare afternoon together without another depressive spike. Weiss tapped her foot against the grass as she waited for Flint to finish the paragraph. They had been sitting at the table for almost an hour, and the boy had yet to actually make anything bigger than a coelacanth float for more than a few seconds without sending it flying across the field. And truthfully, part of her was thinking that he never would. They had been at it for 2 weeks, and he was still showing next to no signs of improvement. While gravity dust was definitely very difficult to use, someone so adept with dust in general, such as Flint, should not have been having as much trouble as he was. "Remember," she said, trying her best to muster as much patience as she could. "You want to be pulsating your aura for pull. The slower your pulsations, the weaker the gravity well." Got it, he said with a nod. Holding the purple dust crystal over the lump of iron, Weiss watched as he activated his aura. Flint's aura was actually something that interested her. It seemed to never be a constant color, instead swapping between whatever color he used as an accent that day. Sometimes it would be blue, others it would be yellow. Today, though, it was a bright green. As she watched it slowly pulse around the small crystal, she held her breath, at least hoping the iron wouldn't fly at her. Thankfully, he seemed to be doing well. The iron bar lifted off the table slowly and rose up to hover just a few inches below the dust crystal. Holding it there for a good 30 seconds, she finally gave him a nod which told him to lower it again. Which, to her surprise, he did. Though it wasn't much, it was a lot better than what he had done previously. "Not bad. A rare compliment." He grinned effortlessly and placed the crystal down. "Finally done something right." "It took you long enough." She smirked, causing the boy to laugh and return to the book. In truth, Weiss was quite surprised by how not unenjoyable the study sessions were. When she had first accepted the request, the idea of tutoring the arrogant Elysian was one she had assumed would simply lead to a few hours of sheer annoyance. And while that was certainly still the case of occasion, like when Flint had almost killed them both, there were definitely moments where she found herself genuinely enjoying the boy's company. It was very different to how she enjoyed the company of her team, or people like Pyrrha and Ren. Though she never pretended to be anyone but herself with all of them, she'd always felt a little weird being snarky with them. Ruby always seemed a little too sweet to take jabs at, Yang merely turned everything into a joke, and Blake's mood was always a little too quick to sour. Flint, however, didn't seem to care. In fact, he actually seemed to like when they bickered, and definitely gave as good as he got. Aside from that small detail, though, there were definitely other things that made conversing with him fun. With him being from Atlas, she was free to talk in her native tongue, which, while being fluent in Valak, always felt more natural to her. There was also their shared passion for music and dust, and conversation usually took a turn towards one of their experiences performing. Weiss had even laughed at one of Flint's stories of when he'd been playing at a jazz bar in Mantle before a fight broke out, to which he had simply picked up the tempo to match it. "So," he said, as she leaned back against a glyph, "be real with me. How bad do you miss Decrofish?" Weiss let out a small sigh at the mention of it. "So much," she breathed, remembering the last time she'd had it while back home. "You would think that Vale, being a port kingdom, would know how to cook a fish. Tell me about it." He groaned back, turning the page but clearly not paying attention. "Me and Neon have been searching since the Vital tournament, but not a single place round here does anything close to home. MHM," she hummed, knowing the feeling. "The closest we have is Gurin's." "Really? I ain't tried there?" "It's mediocre at best." She shrugged. "Gotcha. So what kind of girl are ya?" he said, Weiss catching the interest in his voice. "Monfish or Angelsflossen?" "Cravenlaber," she replied. Just as she expected, the boy raised his eyebrow in surprise. "What? Just because I'm rich, that doesn't mean I have to enjoy the fancy places. Cravenlaber tastes better than any of those places for much less." "Well, I definitely can't deny that," he said, as his stomach rumbled. "Besides," Weiss sighed, "I know the owners for both Monfish and Angelsflossen, and I would rather not give either of them any money." It was true. Just like her father, the owners for both restaurants made frequent use of honest labor on their ships, and while that wouldn't have bothered her too much in the past, it definitely did now. Just like with learning how to be a better team member and a better friend, Weiss liked to think that her time in Vale had made her a somewhat better person, or at the very least, opened her eyes to what practices shouldn't be supported. "Yeah, rumors about them ain't too good from what I hear." Weiss merely gave a nod and pointed to the next object she wanted Flint to lift. A glyph appeared and pushed John's old armor along the table. With the boy's constant training with Pirop paying off, he had finally decided to cast off the rather shoddily made chestplate in favor of something a little more sturdy that suited his skills. Of course, Ruby had been more than happy to help him with the forging, and he had gifted her the old one in return to do with as she pleased. Since Ruby was her partner, Weiss was more than happy to assume that extended to her too, and had commandeered its use. "All right, enough of this fishy conversation," she said, suppressing the grin at one of her expertly made puns, which she was oddly happy had made the boy chuckle. "Next object." "Easily done," he replied with a smug grin. Sure enough, the Elysian repeated the same process he had with the lump of iron. With the chestplate being both bigger and heavier, Weiss had expected them to meet another hurdle, but the boy finally seemed to be getting the hang of it since he raised it up with both control and ease. Trying to see if he was ready for a little more, she coughed to get his attention. "Good. Now keep it in place and continue to push it from below. Slowly extend the duration of your pulsation while decreasing how frequent they are, till it's a constant," he finished for her. "I remember that much." She gave another nod and watched the boy perform the exercise. While the armor jittered a little in place, he quickly succeeded in getting it back under control and made the full transition. With his hand underneath the armor, she held up a hand, and he cut the stream of purple light and let the armor drop, smoothly hooking it around his arm. "Not bad," she said, not wanting to praise him too much since any compliment seemed to only increase his ego. "Please, I'm practically a pro already," he replied and flicked the crystal into the air. Her face turned to an immediate scowl. "What have I told you about treating gravity dust like that?" she said firmly. "Relax, the crystal's expended already." He smiled and pointed it at a nearby flower bed. "See. Flint do." She made to stand up, but the dust was already active. A large, uncontrolled gravity well expanded from the gem and hit the flower bed. The sounds of stirring dirt reached her ears as the flowers and bushes were ripped from their place and flew towards them. Ducking low, she barely avoided the shrubbery as it soared overhead, showering her white hair and clothes with dirt and worms. Barely a second passed before she jumped to her feet. "How many times must I tell you?" she yelled angrily, and brushed a worm from her fringe. Gravity dust is not something to play around with. Oh, come on, Flint replied and dropped the crystal, which she caught with a glyph to prevent more damage. It was whiter than your hair. How was I suppo? Because gravity dust doesn't lose its strength as the crystal diminishes, she snapped. It said so in Chapter 1. Okay. He fiddled with his fedora nervously. I maybe skipped that part. Weiss' eyes narrowed. Hey, I told you book learning was never my strong suit. I'm starting to think your only strong suit is being an idiot who likes to show off, she snarled. What the hell were you even trying to do anyway? Prove a point? Well, Cogger. Weiss was cut off as Flint pulled a hand from behind his back to reveal a pure white tulip that had likely been resting in the flower bed only seconds ago. It was a simple action, one that many boys had done before him, but this one caused her to stop like none of the others had. It confused her at first. How could it not when most of their sessions usually ended in a fight? However, while that was usually how they ended, a majority of their sessions consisted of talking that she usually found fun. Is that why I'm usually so annoyed at him? She asked herself internally, her eyes locked on the flower. Because he keeps ruining the mood? With those thoughts stirring through her head, she felt her palms begin to sweat and her heart begin to pick up. That hadn't even happened with Neptune. No, she interrupted herself, tearing her eyes away from the tulip to look at Flint's face to see a hint of confidence in his eyes. The boy is an arrogant ass. Finally composing herself, Weiss slapped the flower aside and seized up the book she had let him study from. Brushing first from it, she stormed toward the hallways that led to the cafeteria, determined to get some distance between them. However, she barely made it halfway when she heard his voice call out towards her. Weiss! She ignored him. Hold up. No! She spat back at him, not bothering to slow her pace. So you don't want an answer to your question? I don't want anything from you right now. We both know that ain't true. That finally succeeded in getting her to stop. Turning on the spot, she gave the boy an unamused look and crossed her arm. What on remnant are you talking about? Oh, come on. He flicked some dirt off of his fedora. I see how you look at me while we're talking. Why can't you just admit you like spending time with me? Because you spend half the time acting like an arrogant ass, she swore angrily. Well, forgive me for trying to impress you. That is not how you impress me, Weiss growled, feeling more annoyance than she normally would at that all-too-common reasoning. That is how you make me feel the need to add a paragraph to my dust app called the Flint Rule. Big, bold letters saying don't play with gravity dust. You have a dust app? He said, curiosity overtaking his voice and causing her eyes to narrow dangerously. Not the time. Got it. Weiss simply stood there and watched the boy shuffle awkwardly. The fact that he had basically just admitted that he was trying to impress her had not gone amiss, and in truth was probably the most annoying thing that had happened that day. It always annoyed her when people tried to impress her because it always showed they thought she was beyond them, but it annoyed her more with Flint than any of the others. The fact he had always been straightforward and honest had been the aspect of his arrogance that she actually liked. It not only showed her that he didn't have her placed on a pedestal, but that he had a confidence that many seemed to lack. All right then, he sighed and produced a clone in front of himself. Stepping into it, he emerged with pristine clothes and a yellow tie where his previous green one had been. I've tried Neon's way, but that shit clearly ain't working. Time for cobalts. Raising an eyebrow as the boy's stance became a lot more confident. Standing up straight, he put a hand on his hip and gave her a firm look. I don't chase girls or try to impress them, he said with a wave of his hand. They say no, I leave it be. But I like you. Not for being the heiress, not for being gorgeous, but because you have fire and passion. For dust and music. Both of those are important to me. If dust was important to you, then you wouldn't be treating gravity dust so reckless. Weiss was cut off as she saw Flint's hand move with startling speed, releasing something into the air. Annoyance almost flared within her as she saw it was a gravity crystal, but a second later she felt herself being pulled forward by a perfectly executed gravity well. Thin and narrow, only around her waist so that she could still breath, and not so strong that she couldn't easily counteract it with minimal effort. Flint too was caught in the well, and pulled forward until they both met in the middle, Flint's hand catching her waist and holding her firm. The enticing smell of his aftershave filled her nose and almost made her hum. Taking a second to compose herself, she looked up to see Flint's brown eyes glancing down at her. The whole action caused her breath to catch, and though she should have pulled away, she didn't. "You're a good teacher, so your first lesson was enough," he said in a calm voice. "I told you I'm good when I get hands-on with dust, but I wanted to spend more time with you, so Neon told me to let you feel in control. But I may have took it too far and wasted my time." "Ouch," he chuckled, unfazed by the insult. "Time with me ain't exactly a waste. Your opinion of yourself is so high you would make an acrophobic sick." He shrugged away the insult, just as he usually did. "Come on, one date," he said with a grin. "I know you like me enough for that." Keeping eye contact with him, Weiss finally pushed herself away and let out a sigh of her own. In truth, she was half tempted to take him up on it. They really did have a lot in common, and she couldn't deny that she liked how he challenged her both intellectually and in terms of personality. However, unlike Neptune, she could believe Flint was serious and wasn't sure if she wanted to explore what she felt. So still unsure how to answer, she took a step back and turned to walk away. "I'll take that as a no," he said, the disappointment in his voice evident. Looking back, she gave him a small glance. Still unsure of her feelings and wanting some time to think on it, she shook her head and continued to walk away. "I'll think about it," she called back. Not even bothering to look again, since she knew his ego was about to soar, she pushed open the door to the cafeteria. She had expected just another day of boring tutoring followed by some time with her team, maybe helping cheer Blake up since she had been fretting more and more about her parents' arrival. What she definitely hadn't been expecting was being asked on a date and considering saying yes. Letting out a sigh at the confusing thoughts ahead of her, she slowly made her way over to Ruby and Blake and sat down. Earning a look from the both of them, she simply pulled a cookie from Ruby's plate and leaned back against her glyph again, making it clear she didn't want to talk. Chapter 48, Aggravation. It had been a long week for Blake. The teachers had finally decided to start preparing them in earnest for an upcoming exam, which meant a stack of coursework that was quite literally too big for her to carry in a single hand. So almost every spare minute she'd had during the week had been spent poring over books and journals. In fact, she was pretty sure that she had both read and written more words in the past week than she had in the last few years. All of that time spent huddled over a desk had left very little time for anything else, such as training or time with her girlfriend, and had left her shoulders and back a little stiff. Unfortunately though, for as much work as she had to do, it had not managed to pull her focus from the thing she was dreading the most: her parents' arrival in Vale. With every second that she had spare, her attention had immediately returned to her scroll to look up more stories on the Fauna's website. However, since her parents had left 5 days ago, it had merely been out of habit rather than expecting any actual news. No, she doubted she would receive any actual news for a good few days until they finally arrived. What she did know though was that both her mom and dad were traveling to Vale, and that they were using trucks and boats. That was hardly a surprise though, since she knew her dad was terrified of flying and would avoid it whenever he could. Regardless of knowing that there was no new information, the compulsive tick of checking her device remained, and even as she sat outside on what Ruby had dubbed a mandatory relaxation session, the soft breeze following a short rainfall blowing through her hair, her eyes were still glued to her device. So much so that she was caught completely off guard when a large glob of mud struck her in the shoulder. "Gods damn it, Weiss!" she growled, looking up to see a shining white Borbatusk rolling in a patch of mud. "Will you keep that thing under control?" "Hey!" Weiss snapped her fingers at the beast, causing it to stop and look at her curiously with mud dripping from its body as she turned back. "And it is under control, thank you. I don't know why it did that. My Lancer is perfectly behaved." All of them looked towards the giant, white hornet summon that was asleep a few feet away. Though what Weiss had said was technically true, it would be more correct to say that the Queen Lancer actually did nothing at all. Unless in combat, every time Weiss summoned it, the giant beast simply went straight to sleep and ignored any order it was given. "Aw, come on guys!" Yang chuckled, scraping mud off herself and throwing it at the boar summon, which quickly waddled over to her. "He's just a playful little mudball." She reached out and scratched behind its ears. "Who's a good little mudball, huh?" "Yeah, well he can keep his mud to himself in future." Blake grumbled and swiped the sticky filth from her shoulder. "I'm tired of getting caught in the splash zone of your antics." "Guys," Ruby pouted, lifting her head from where it had been on her lap. "This is supposed to be a relaxing time. No fighting allowed." Whatever. Blake scowled, returning to her scroll. Fine. Weiss sighed, dismissing the boar which had tackled Yang to the ground and making all the mud that was on it drop onto the blonde. Shaking her head, she scrolled down the page and simply looked at smaller articles about her home. Just as when she had left, the stories weren't very big. After all, it was hard to find huge stories in a small town. As such, most of it was simply smaller stories regarding the expansion of the port, fresh attempts to build into the desert. There were also a few white fan articles, but they were quickly passed over as she had no interest in reading about them. Hey, Ruby said quietly, reaching up to swipe a little more of the mud away. You okay? I'm fine, Blake replied shortly. Why? You've just been a little. She hesitated and tapped her fingers together. Grumpy lately. You sure you're okay for the clearing mission later? To be quite honest, the constant questioning of her mood from her team was getting tiring, and only making it worse. Sure, she had been on edge a little, but how could she not be? Her estranged parents were going to be arriving in 4 days, at most, and she would have to finally make the decision on whether she would see them or not. Who wouldn't be a little antsy? She wished her friends would understand that. It's killing Raalm, she breathed impatiently. If anything, it'll be cathartic. Glancing over the top of her scroll, she saw some doubt in Ruby's silver eyes. But as their eyes met, the doubt faded and she gave a small nod and returned to her position on Blake's lap. Okay. Looking down at the Reaper, Blake immediately felt a little bad for being so short with her. She knew Ruby was just concerned, so she reached down with her free hand to run her fingers through the strands of red-tipped hair. It was a small action, but one that both her and the redhead found comforting. All right, Snow Angel. Yang groaned as she raised her feet and stretched her arm. Wet t-shirt contest, and then we can practice this new move. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Weiss spin her rapier and blast a geyser of water at the blonde, instantly washing away the mud and causing the ground to be even more sodden. Before it could even settle though, Yang stopped her stretching by slamming her fists together. A small heatwave ripped from the girl, instantly drying the ground around her. With steam billowing around her, even Blake had to admit she struck an impressive figure. You got this, sis. Ruby cheered with confidence only for it to falter a second later. Just face the other way, please. Thanks. The brawlers scoffed and turned around to face away from them. Okay, Weiss. Hit me like I know you want to. Without hesitation, Weiss pointed her rapier at the floor a few feet from Yang. A brown glyph appeared and a large gray spike shot at the blonde, who crossed her arms to block it. The stone crumbled on impact, Yang not even budging. In fact, the only thing that happened was the brute's hair shone a dazzling blonde. Ah! Yang grinned and shook her arm. Love me so much you can't even hit me properly. Weiss rolled her eyes and shook her head. All right, ready? The heiress gave a quick nod of her head and raised her weapon as Yang clenched her fist. Even from where she and Ruby were sitting, Blake could feel the air grow hotter and hotter, until her partner's hair burst into flames. With a small amount of interest as to whether her partner would finally achieve her goal, she watched as Yang reared her fist back and struck out toward Weiss. As she did, the fire from her hair traveled down her arm, the flames licking at the skin and folding in on themselves before finally surging outwards from Yang's closed fist in a significantly large fireball. Though Weiss summoned a hard light barrier to block it, she needn't have bothered since the fire died out halfway between them. Aw, damn it! Yang breathed with no small amount of disappointment, before instantly perking back up. Better than last time, though. Again! Not needing to watch Yang repeat the same process over and over again, Blake looked back down at her scroll and found a small article about someone she had known, Mata. Apparently his mother had opened a small little restaurant on the island that people were enjoying. It was news that wouldn't really mean much, but Blake knew it had always been the woman's dream, so couldn't help but smile a little. Been a few days since I've seen you smile, Ruby commented with a smile. I've missed it. Hard to smile when I'm just looking at numbers and equations for Peach all day, Blake replied, continuing to read the article. Hard to stay awake too. Yeah, Ruby said, her smile fading a little. Blake? MMM? You know you can tell Dash. Hey girls! The extremely excitable voice cut Ruby off and Blake couldn't help but groan. Looking up, she saw Neon standing in front of her wearing a pair of ripped blue leggings, dark shorts, and a sky blue top, each emblazoned with a rainbow of varying kinds. Though Blake had been trying to be more hospitable to the girl, especially after the conversation with Flint, she wasn't in the mood for someone with so much energy at that moment. Stood next to her was Flint, wearing his usual crisp suit and fedora, though his accents were a pleasant pink today. "Oh," Ruby replied, her eyes flicking to Blake before returning Neon's smile. "Hey, Neon." "Hey, Flint." "Sup, guys?" Flint said, his eyes immediately flicking over to Weiss. "Nothing much," the leader replied. "Just taking a team break from coursework." "You?" "Saw me." Neon yawned in an exaggerated manner. "Flint kept me cooped up so long I was starting to feel gray." "Better gray and coursework done and colorful and fail in classes," he said with a grin. Blake doubted Neon would agree. If there was one thing she had learned about Neon, it was that she prided herself in being colorful. If there was ever a time where she wasn't sparkling like a rainbow, it probably meant there was something very wrong. Though even then, it was always rectified very quickly. "Is that Fauna's?" the girl asked suddenly, completely ignoring her partner and leaning down to look at Blake's scroll. "I like that sight. I like looking at all the tails. I mean, they're not as pretty as mine, but tails are super awesome in general. Shame everyone in Atlas hides them." "I agree, though probably for different reasons." Her remark earned a poke in the stomach from Ruby. It was impossible to tell whether Neon had understood the jab, because the girl had already stood up and pounced over to the sleeping Queen Lancer. "Wow!" she exclaimed and leaned down close. As she did, the hornet's head moved a tiny bit towards her. "I've never seen one of these up close. I didn't think they would be so fluff-dash." "BZZZZT." As Neon's hand reached out to touch it, all hell broke loose. The Queen Lancer, which had been peacefully sleeping for almost an hour, suddenly awoke and a loud buzzing tore through the quiet courtyard, loud enough to make them all flinch as it rose into the air and smacked Neon aside with its large head. The girl's quick reflexes took effect, but the offended summon immediately fired sharp projectiles that slammed into the ground around her and kicked up patches of dirt. Its extendable stinger shot out at a nearby tree, ripping a branch away and throwing it so hard that it dug up the ground Neon had jumped off only seconds ago. "Hey!" Weiss shouted, quickly arriving between the pair as both Blake and Ruby stood to their feet. "What are you doing?" A loud chattering joined the buzzing as the Lancer's mandibles shook angrily. With a swipe of its huge body, the stinger shot out and slammed aggressively against the floor. As if to protect his partner, Flint stepped in front and raised his weapon to stop it should it attack. "Stop this! Now!" Weiss ordered her angered summon. Just as usual, it paid Weiss no mind and continued its angry buzzing, so the girl raised her hand to dispel it. However, seeing it as an opportunity, Blake rushed forward and seized the girl's arm. "Leave it!" she demanded, looking Weiss right in the eye. Thankfully the girl listened, but kept her hand where it was. "Ruby," she said, and turned back to her girlfriend. "She's your best friend. Sort this out." Their eyes met for a second, and she saw that the silver orbs were filled with confusion. However, with a small nod towards Weiss, the girl finally understood and scratched the back of her head. Thankfully the summon seemed unwilling to attack Flint, so Ruby had time to think. It only took a second, however, and Blake witnessed an idea form behind her girlfriend's eyes. "I think that..." She looked from the Lancer to Neon. "Neon should apologize for trying to touch it." "What?" Weiss asked incredulously with a scowl. "It's aura, Ruby. It doesn't understand dash." "Neon!" Flint said in an authoritative voice, stepping aside so that he was no longer in her way. Blake pushed Weiss backwards a little too. "Apologize." Though she exchanged an anxious glance with her partner, the girl gave a nervous nod and slowly walked forward. Despite the buzzing increasing in volume, the Lancer didn't attack. I'm really sorry, Miss Lancer," she said in a low voice, as if she knew she had done wrong. "I really didn't mean to scare you. You just looked really fluffy. I meant no disrespect." Blake had to give it to the faunus. As stupid as she looked, she really was treating it like a serious matter. Though given what Flint had said about her, it shouldn't have really been a surprise. Thankfully though, it seemed to work and the buzzing grew less intense until the great hornet landed back on the ground. "What the?" Weiss mumbled, glancing at the now docile Lancer with confusion as Blake let her go. "We've been trying to tell you, dummy," Yang replied as she sidled up and pulled Ruby into a hug. "They act on their own all the time. You're just lucky my awesome sis here knows how to handle them. Heh. Ruby replied and pushed Yang away. It's nothing. They all just feel like Weiss, just different parts of her. Interesting. Flint chuckled, walking up to the Lancer and kneeling down in front of it. Lancers look much prettier in white. Though it chattered a little as he held out his hand, it quickly moved its own head in to let him touch it. If Blake wasn't mistaken, a small blush fell across Ruby's face, and the Reaper looked away from her partner. However, as if embarrassed herself, Weiss raised her hand and dismissed the creature before turning to face Neon and Flint. I'm sorry, she said, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. It shouldn't have acted like that. No problem. Flint shrugged and rose to his feet. Not the first time Neon touching something she shouldn't be has landed us in trouble. Right, nah? You say that like it happens a lot, the girl pouted. But Flint's right. I should have been more considerate of its feelings. Feelings? Weiss hummed. Right. She turned to her partner. Ruby, with me, please. Oh, sure. Ruby followed Weiss, who had already taken off, but turned back to address Blake and Yang. Meet us at Glinda's office in 2 hours. Got it. They both replied with a sigh. We should head off too, Neon said, cheering up a little more. Ivory will freeze us if we're late for practice. Exchanging a goodbye as the two Elysians walked off towards the training rooms, Blake returned to her spot under the tree and leaned down with a groan to pick up her scroll. The earlier sudden movement had caused her stiff shoulders a little pain. Knowing that wouldn't be great for fighting Grimm, she pocketed her device and set about stretching her limbs a little. At least that is finally going to get sorted, she grumbled at her partner. Finally, Yang chuckled. Though if Mudball digging out my underwear is Weiss' repressed lesbianism, then I'm gonna need a way to let her down gently. You're really calling it Mudball? Blake shook her head, ignoring the other comment. Perfect name for it. Yang shrugged with a small bark of laughter. Anyway, wanna spar a little before we go hunting? With nothing else to do, and in need of a warm-up, she gave a small nod. Sure. If there was one thing that Blake loved about the more densely packed forests of Sanus over the sparse trees of Anima, it was that the heaviest of rainfalls were defended against by the thick canopy of leaves. Many times during her earlier training she had found herself trekking through swamps and wetlands, both of which required so much more energy and tired her out. But the fact that Emerald Forest protected itself from the elements for the most part, at least enough that the ground was still solid, meant they had a much easier time traversing the overgrown area. It was also good because fighting Grimm while sloshing around in thick mud tended to cause more mistakes. And when fighting creatures that wanted to rip people limb from limb, even a single mistake could be fatal. So, thanking Raalm as she landed on dry ground from her backflip, she slashed upwards with her sheath and cut the Borbatusk in half. It had been almost an hour since they had entered the Emerald Forest, and so far the Grimm had been semi-regular. Barely 5 minutes would pass before they stumbled on a small group of Beowulfs or Borbatusk, even a few King Tygius. But while it was rather easy to handle as a team, the frequency was rather alarming. With how frequently the forest was cleared, they certainly shouldn't have been encountering as many Grimm as they had. Ow hoa hoa! Ruby! Yang groaned with her hands over her ears. You got a shot on it yet? Any second now. Away a dash. A gunshot rang through the clearing, and the loud howling came to an abrupt stop. Seconds later, a black, human-sized monkey with lank limbs and a grotesquely bulging throat fell to the ground and began to disintegrate. Happy that the howling had finally stopped and they had some quiet, Blake let out a pleasured groan. Got it, Ruby cheered happily. Stupid howlers, Blake grumbled, rubbing her sore ears. They really did migrate, huh? Given that we fought another pack of wisps today, I would have thought that obvious. Weiss breathed and leaned over. Ruby, how much longer until we get to the blockage? 15 minutes, I think. She pulled out her scroll to check the map Glinda had sent them. Oh, 10 minutes actually. Good. Yang yawned and put a new string of shells into her gauntlets. So what do you think is causing the blockage? Grimm. As usual. Ruby shrugged and returned her scroll to her pocket. Probably beetles. While not a Grimm that Blake was too familiar with, since they were native to Sanus, she did know that they had a tendency to use surrounding trees and rocks to create dams that blocked water supplies. It was an especially cruel tactic that forced smaller villages to either go and clear the area, or eventually become distressed at the lack of water and fall to the grim their negative emotions would attract. Either way, they were generally classified as pest-type grim, and were considered a top priority mission on most boards in Vale. However, seeing as it was Beacon's job to keep the Emerald Forest clear, that mission had been entrusted to them. Thankfully, even as they followed the river that was still partially flowing, Blake could tell that the group was likely not very big. Mostly likely 3 or 4. Any more and the river would have been brought to a complete halt in the day since Ojman had reported it. "Are they tough?" she asked, having never fought one before. "They can be," Yang shrugged. "They're pretty big and have some nasty tail spikes. Especially the sergeants." "Fair enough." "What, not gonna ask what sergeants are?" "Let me guess. Bigger and more spikes?" You're no fun when you're grumpy." Throwing her best friend a scowl, she pushed ahead to stand next to her girlfriend, taking her hand in the process. So far the mission had not been as cathartic as she had hoped. While there definitely had been a lot of Grim to kill, they had all been the usual young Grim that was easily handled with a few bullets or a well-placed cut. That was to be expected, of course, with how often the place was cleared out, but with the lack of anything to test her newer skills, and therefore exert herself, she had been able to find nothing to take her mind of what had been bugging her all week. Even as she followed her team up the path, her mind wandered back to what she would do when her parents arrived. Would they even be coming to Beacon itself? Their business was with the council, so surely they would have no reason to visit a school that wasn't even in the main city. But did that mean she shouldn't travel to see them? If she couldn't even take the 5-minute journey into town to meet them, then how was she ever going to reach out? It was all just such a mess. How had she done this to her life? How had she caused so much damage that she was so estranged from the parents she had loved, that she still loved, so dearly? Was it just one mistake? Or was it repeated mistakes? She didn't know, only knew that it was likely both. One mistake that she kept on repeating. "Okay, everyone." Ruby hushed them, slowing her pace as they approached another clearing with the river running through it. "Should be right here." Dropping to a crouch, they all separated to nearby trees and scanned out over the clearing. Sure enough, just as Ruby had predicted, 5 giant beaver Grim roamed around the area next to the river. Each one stood at roughly 9 feet on all fours, and their thick black fur was sleek and gleaming in the sun, as was the white armor around its face. Vicious red eyes peeked out from the eye sockets, and large buck teeth that looked sharp enough to break stone protruded from both their upper and lower jaws. Just as Yang had said, their tails had a few nasty-looking rows of spikes underneath that were gouging deep holes in the ground. Their effect on the area was also evident. With only a day to work, they had stripped so many trees and thrown them into the lake that they had likely doubled the size of the clearing they were occupying. Tree stumps and shattered rock littered the landscape, and it seemed the tails had also done a number on the flora that had been growing there too. 5 versus 4. Yang whispered from behind a nearby tree. "Should be easy." "Big and bulky though," Ruby muttered in response. "We should try and pick one off before we go in." "Or Weiss can even the odds a little," Blake suggested. "Weiss isn't summoning right now," Ruby answered simply. "What?" She scowled, since Weiss usually summoned without hesitation whenever given the chance. "Why not? It could help us here. If they're behaving erratically, then I don't want to risk using them in combat," Weiss countered. "They work fine in combat. Look, I just don't trust them right now. Can we just pick one off?" "They're bulky, so they won't go down quietly," Yang observed. "Well, maybe if Weiss had listened to us earlier, we wouldn't have to risk getting one Sepa dash." "Blah dash." Ruby didn't need to finish interrupting Blake's bitter retort. Before the word had even finished leaving the leader's mouth, the hairs on the back of Blake's neck tingled and she dodged backwards away from the tree as its base burst into splinters. Feeling it would shower over her, she heard the thrown rock smash through another behind her and turned to see that all 5 of the beetles glaring at her with teeth bared. Before she could even take another step, another had stood up on its hind legs and thrown the tree trunk in its hands. "Move!" Ruby yelled as it crashed along the ground towards them. Not needing to be told twice, all 4 of them jumped over it and into the clearing. "Weiss, you're with me. Yang, get the sergeant." She indicated towards a larger beevile with white armor jutting out of its fur. "Blake, you take its friend." "Got it, sis." Yang nodded and signaled for Blake to follow. With a final look at the other 2, who were already running off towards the 3 Grim over the other side of the river, Blake turned and ran towards the remaining creature. At the very least, it looked like something that would put her new skills to the test. So pulling her sword from her back as she charged, she slipped a new clip into the handle and prepared for battle. The world turned to a blur around her as she sprinted, only slowing to duck under a tree trunk but quickly slicing upwards with her cleaver to split the wood in half. Continuing to dodge rocks and debris, she soon found herself in front of the sitting beast and ducked forwards to carve a clean arc into hind legs. If she could disable them, then it would be much less of a threat. Unfortunately, as her blade neared the soft flesh, the Grim lowered a rock to protect itself. Feeling her blade glance off the stone, she dodged to the side as the vile thing dropped back to all fours. Transitioning her dodge into a backflip, she managed to avoid a swing of the Grim's large claws and quickly slipped her sword free of its sheath, transforming it into a gun and unloading a few rounds into its face. While doing little to damage the beast, the rounds thankfully caused it to recoil away from her. Seizing on the opportunity, she dashed forward and spun to prepare a blade beam. However, just as her pirouette finished and she came face to face with the beast again, she saw it had already recovered and was reaching out to grab her with its mouth wide open. It was a perfect moment to test something. Canceling her own attack, Blake channeled her aura and activated her semblance. Just as usual, the creation of the clone gave her a burst of speed, and she used it to jump over the beetle's arms and onto its armored face. At the same time, she heard a loud snap echo behind her, and a flash of purple flew past her head. It had worked. Her clone had finished her attack and presented her an opening as the mammal was forced to recoil yet again. Not wanting to waste it, she pushed off hard towards the soft back of the Grim, ready to jam her blade into its spine and shear it in half. Or at least that was the plan. Much to her surprise, as her footing switched from armor to fur, she found herself immediately unbalanced by what felt like an oily substance that coated its body. "Ah!" she yelped as her foot slipped out from underneath her, and she found herself tumbling over the side and to the ground. Unfortunately for her, the Grim was still backing away, and the giant, clawed hand landed on her leg, the weight of it sending pain ripping up her side. Clearly sensing it had something in its grasp, Blake quickly felt herself being picked up and slammed roughly into the ground. Thankfully, while the impact hurt like hell, she was able to push the pain aside and crossed her swords over the thing's wrist. Ripping them back, she severed the limb and fell back to the floor as the beevile let out a bark of pain. A glint of red sparked in its eyes, and she was forced to use her semblance to push herself out of the way of its tail. Mud was sprayed everywhere as the thick, black limb slammed into the ground, its spikes burying themselves in the dirt. Without a second of hesitation, the great beast ripped it aside, the spikes churning up the ground like a plow and spraying dirt and rocks everywhere, the largest of which it picked up with its remaining hand. The clone's attack seemed to have shattered its bottom teeth though, so while the top pair were still intact, she knew the battle would be a lot easier now. For another minute, Blake exchanged blows with the beast. While she didn't particularly feel there was much danger left, it was always best to be safe. Besides, the beevile was still doing a good job of defending with the rock it had seized earlier, as well as using it to attack. Every time she tried to go underneath it to where she knew its soft underbelly was, it would hop backwards and slam the boulder down to force her to retreat. It was rather frustrating, so after a minute of dancing around and looking for an opening, she decided to create one for herself. As its arm and head came down once again to block access to its stomach, Blake allowed herself to tumble backwards as if she had lost balance. Falling to her, but to be more convincing, she couldn't help but smile as it fell for the bait. Without hesitation, the beevile reared its arm back up and used its full body weight to bring the stone crashing down on her. Waiting for the perfect moment to strike, she laid there until she saw it and once again activated her semblance. Pushing herself to the side, she spun midair and slashed out at its arm, only to find her blade hitting another target entirely. "Gah!" she heard Ruby breathe as Gamble's shroud slipped across her stomach. Blake had no idea where the girl had come from, but she immediately felt a wave of frustration pulse through her. Not only had the girl ruined her attack, but the hit to her stomach had clearly caused Ruby's to miss too. "What are white dash?" Before she could finish, the rock she had just avoided struck her in the side of the head and sent her flying backwards. Tumbling to the ground with her ears ringing from the hit, she looked up just in time to see Ruby stumbling due to being caught by the arm itself. Before the leader could correct herself, the beevil's tail swung around and crushed her to the floor. Acting on instinct, Blake pushed herself up and charged at the distracted beast. "Yawn!" she yelled at her partner, who had already finished her battle and was running in to help. Transforming Gamble's shroud into sickle form, she tossed it over the grim and slammed the bladed sheath into its exposed neck. A loud bark of pain greeted her ears, but she felt the ribbon in her hand tug and kept a firm hold on both it and the sheath as she was dragged over its body. As her feet landed on the other side, its head fell to the ground and slowly began to disintegrate. Breathing heavily, she looked around and saw that the area was clear and that Weiss was helping Ruby to her feet. "Are you okay, Dash? What the hell were you doing?" Blake shouted at her girlfriend, cutting off Weiss' question as her frustration boiled over. Not only had Ruby ruined that attack, but she had put herself in trouble again. "I had that handled. We were finished and you were down," Ruby replied slowly with confusion in her eyes. "I thought you needed Dash." "Saving?" Blake scoffed incredulously. "I'm not a damsel in distress, Ruby. I can handle a single grim." A hand landed on her chest and pushed her back slightly. Where Blake had once been glaring at Ruby's silver eyes, she was now met by Yang's red ones. "But you clearly can't handle your emotions," the blonde growled. "I suggest you back off and calm down before you alert more grim to our position." Looking from her angered partner to her hurt girlfriend, Blake felt her chest rise and fall rapidly. She knew Yang was blaming her for being spotted by the Beebles, and knew it wasn't completely wrong, but definitely wasn't in the mood to stand there and be told to calm down when Ruby had almost gotten herself killed trying to protect her again. So, with a dismissive wave, she turned and stalked off towards the woods, leaving the rest of her team to handle cleaning up the river.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.